Welcome to OnCrawl's SEO in Orbit webinar series, the first series taking SEO into space. SEO in Orbit is a series of webinars running through June 24th and taking you on a tour of the galaxy of technical SEO. At the end of the series, we'll send all of the top tips from each episode into space, for real, on June 27th. So today's episode is Unlocking the Secrets of Indexing, and we'll be taking questions at the end of the webinar, so you can ask them at any time in the webinar question box or in Twitter using the hashtag OnCrawlInOrbit. Okay, so today's guest is Kevin Indig, and Kevin has helped startups acquire over 100 million. There we go. I have a lag on this end, just a second. Okay, our guest today is Kevin Indig. And Kevin has helped startups acquire over 100 million users over the last 10 years. He's the VP of SEO and content at G2. He's a mentor for growth at German Accelerator. And before that, he ran SEO at Atlassian and Dailymotion. His specialty is user acquisition, brand building, and user retention. Companies he's worked for include eBay, Eventbrite, Bosch, Samsung, Pinterest, Columbia, UBS, and many others. He also curates, and I guess I should say publishes, Tech Boost, which is absolutely one of my favorite professional newsletters. So Kevin, does Tech Boost reflect what's occupying you during a week, or do you have to set aside time and headspace to create content?
Actually, hi, by the way, stoked to be on. I actually set aside some time only dedicated to that. So what I do is whenever I read an article, I store it on Airtable. I have like a little system there. And then I set aside specific time to just write and put it all together.
Okay, that sounds like a good process because I know the results work there.
Yeah, it keeps you sane and it forces you to not only stay up to date, but also reflect on your thoughts and make sure, everything is sound there. So where this is actually coming from, there's this Richard Feynman quote that says, if you can't explain something in simple terms or in simple ways, then you don't really understand it. And so what I learned a lot through this whole tech-bound journey is that in a lot of times I thought I had understood a topic, but then tried to put it together in simple terms and realized, oh, I have a couple of gaps. So this is where a lot of the motivation for that came from.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense to me. I'm Rebecca Bobel, so I'm a content manager at OnCrawl, so I deal a lot with content. But I'm pathologically technically curious, so between the content and tech balance, that
pathologically,
you can see where my interest comes from. So today we'll be talking about indexing. I don't know if you've seen the really interesting poll that Will Critchlow has been running on Twitter. I think the latest one earlier this week was about keeping pages from being indexed. And I think the final result was something like 60% of SEOs who answered didn't quite get it right. So it's a complex topic. So I think the best thing to do is probably to start out with some of the definitions. So what is crawling by search engines? Do you have a quick definition for crawling?
Yeah, so basically crawling, if I had to put it in simple terms and hold up to my word, I would say that crawling is the technical process of search engines understanding a web page and all of its components.
Okay, so it's sort of a discovery process, you'd say.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if we were going through the step-by-step process, right, there are basically 3 steps, or basically 2 steps that lead up to indexing, and indexing being the 3rd step. So there's crawling, rendering, and indexing. And so the crawling process is something where, by the way, they're technically different. They're handled by different programs, if you will, or different parts of the search engine. And it helps them to find all the URLs that it can then go back to and render and can then go back to an index and eventually rank, right? Which is basically a 4th step if you wanted to.
So what is indexing?
What is indexing? That is a great question. Now, indexing is basically the process of Google adding URLs to its long list of possible results if you want to, right? Like if I had to avoid the word index to describe indexing, I would say Google has a long list of URLs that it can use to rank and show the best results to users for.
Okay. And the other thing that we're going to end up talking about today, I'm pretty sure, are log files. So log files, essentially web servers keep a log or a history every time anyone or anything asks for a resource on that website, whether it's a page itself or a resource. So what are some of the types of informations we can find on a log file?
Yeah, I've become really passionate about log files over time because to me they often are the source of truth when it comes to understanding how Google crawls and renders your site. And so log files in a nutshell are basically server information of how often Google comes to your site and what it does on your site. Again, if I had to put this in plain and simple terms. So we're actually talking about server logs. And they're records. They're basically records of Google as it visits different pages. And you can get a ton of information out of log files, starting from specific status code errors to problems with crawling and rendering, to how much time Googlebot spends on your site and which Googlebot actually comes to your site. So there are obviously different types of Googlebots, and the priorities of which Googlebot Google uses by default have recently changed with mobile first indexing. And so all of that is something you can understand by looking at log files, plus a better understanding of whether your technical site structure is actually something that Google follows or if you have to optimize something there.
Right. So we'll get into more detail about that throughout the rest of this webinar. But we just wanted to make sure that everyone's on the same page as far as those basic terms are concerned. So since we are talking about indexing, what is the best way to check which pages on your website have been indexed?
Yeah, so I actually asked John Mueller about that because when I grew up in SEO, that was about 10 years ago, I still used the site call inquiry on Google to see if the URL was indexed. And I think that's not the best way anymore. And John Mueller verified this on Twitter. And so what he said is to actually use the inspect URL function in Search Console. So, and obviously, if you want to check a batch of URLs, you can just simply submit an XML sitemap and check that sitemap in the coverage report on Search Console.
Okay, so that gives you a definite response from Google as to what they know about already, rather than trying to depend on the search results with an operator.
Yes, I mean, I still use that from time to time. And then there's the info colon operator. So different site queries that slightly have different functions, but I don't think they're representative anymore to really understand if a URL is indexed and if it is the right URL you want to be indexed.
Right. So what are some of the technical elements that facilitate indexing?
Right. So I talked about this a bit in the intro already. So we basically have this three-step process where Google crawls a page, renders it, and indexes it. And they're very important to distinguish because as the web progresses and becomes more sophisticated, more JavaScript frameworks are in use, and so on and so on, Google had to adapt, of course, and they strongly do. So first of all, you want to remember that there are different Googlebots that are used to crawl a site, right? And to crawl and render a site, right? So you have different formats from textual content to images and videos and news, and Google uses different Googlebots for all of these. And so we recently had an announcement in early May, basically a month ago, from Google saying that they upgraded their rendering engine, which now runs on Evergreen Googlebot. And I think that is based on the Chromium engine 74. And so basically the latest Chromium engine, right? And so basically, again, there are these three different steps that lead up to indexing. And they recently changed in terms of priority. So Google used to, for the longest time, crawl with the desktop Googlebot by default. And then they changed it to the smartphone bot. and they're enforcing mobile first indexing, I think, in July. So coming up for everyone, if I remember correctly.
I think that was specifically for new sites in July.
Yeah, specifically for new sites. And so basically Google, when we go back to the first step, right, crawling, which leads up to indexing, super important to not forget. There are basically three ways that Google finds new URLs. There's the classic way of links, right? This is what the whole PageRank patent was based upon, is to find new sites through backlinks or through hyperlinks. But then there are obviously also XML sitemaps, which we talked about before, and then there are past crawls. So there are three different ways for Google to find new URLs. And then there's obviously also a way that Google prioritizes what sites it crawls how often, which is something that we refer to as crawl budget. And there was an article on the Google Webmaster blog recently that also came out in May, or could be in the last couple of weeks or months. That was about crawl budget. And it gave a bit of clarity about how Google prioritizes what sites to crawl. It's basically referring back to URL popularity, of which backlinks or PageRank are a major component. But then, of course, it also looks at status code. So if, for example, you have a ton of 4.4s on your site, that will probably lead Google to tone down the frequency of crawls. And then also if you have redirect chains or loops. So if Google finds that the hygiene on your site is not well and you waste a lot of their crawl budget, they might tone that down. And then lastly, of course, it's impacted by site speed and the server response time. So Google doesn't want to to DDoS your site out of the index orbit. And so they adjust to what your server can handle in terms of crawling. And these are super important to remember, right? Because the first step leads up to indexing. So you have to make sure that your crawling is safe and sound. And then when it comes to rendering, this is where the Caffeine update plays a big role that came out years ago, which updated Google's rendering engine, basically, or rendering structure. And then lastly, there's indexing, right? And again, there are different archives of indexes that Google uses to return certain results, right? So there's probably a different cluster of the index for news results versus regular results or image results. And these are all prioritized by the factors that we mentioned in crawling before. And then lastly, they're ranked in the process, which is a totally different algorithm.
Yeah, and that is actually something we'll probably talk about in a different episode because it's such a separate content. When we're talking about indexing, we're talking about crawl budget and how much we can crawl. So when we want to improve indexing, we want a page to be indexed faster, but we also want more pages to be indexed. Is this sort of two ways to say the same thing for Google?
Well, I think those are two separate things, as in they're both kind of driven by backlinks, or better said, by PageRank for the most part. But to accomplish both, I think you want to go about it a bit differently. So if you want to have if you want pages to get indexed faster, you want to optimize the first two steps, right? You want to make sure that Google can crawl your site as efficient as possible and render your pages as fast as possible, to which, again, we have components like internal linking, sitemaps, service speed, and page speed. And if you want to get more pages indexed, that's where I think the crawling aspect is a bit more important, right? You basically want to make it easier for Google to find all your pages, which is simple when you're a smaller site that has maybe 1,000 URLs, but it's much harder when you're a huge site with millions of different URLs. So G2, for example, or www.g2.com, our site has a ton of pages and with different page types. And we want to make sure that Google is able to find whatever page, no matter how how high or low the crawl depth is, or how many of those pages exist. And that's a major challenge, and we have to approach it from different angles.
when you look at different types of pages, do you find that there are different crawl rates based on the type of page?
Yes, absolutely. I'm finding different crawl rates depending on their backlink profile and their internal linking. And this is where log files are super handy, right? Because that's the source of truth for understanding how often, or basically the source of truth for segmenting your different page types, and then understanding where you lack crawl efficiency or where you have a too high crawl efficiency, right? Where you have imbalances in your crawl frequency.
So do you find that crawl rates and indexing rates correspond on a pretty close basis, that when you know that a page has been crawled, it's going to be very quickly indexed? Or are there differences between the rates of how many pages in a section are crawled and how many pages in that section are indexed?
Yes, now we're talking. Absolutely. This is what I try to outline and describe with this tipper model that I came up with. Because yes, so let's start from the beginning. I across the sites that I worked with and in correspondence with other people in the SEO space, found very high correlations between the crawl frequency and how fast a page is being indexed, and ranking as well. So it seems that at least similar components that drive the speed to index, basically, or indexing, also have a big saying when it comes to ranking a page. So meaning, say you have a ton of backlinks to a certain page template, say it's or a page type, say it's certain landing pages throughout your site. Then what you often find in your log files, and I encourage all of you out there to go out and check your log files and see if this is true. So when there's a high crawl frequency, especially higher than average across your site, then Google indexes these pages faster, and usually they rank higher than other pages. So the short answer is yes.
Okay, we've definitely seen that too, but sometimes it's hard to demonstrate without actually pulling out the logs and doing analysis. So it's one of the things I like about working with OnCrawl. We see so many different sites and so many different schemas. So when we see something that's repeated across many different sites, we know that that becomes sort of a characteristic of SEO rather than just of my specific site.
Sure, and we always have to be a bit careful with these statements, right? I mean, I'm not saying this is definitely a ranking factor or universally true or any of these things. I'm just saying this is what I observe.
Okay. How do you measure exactly a crawl rate of a page? Or when you talk about groups, what do you do to be able to look at the crawl rate of a group?
Right. So basically, the very basis are Googlebot hits, right? So how often does Googlebot or a certain Googlebot come to visit a URL? That is the basis. Now, how you slice and dice this is another question. I personally recommend to look at Google hits or Googlebot hits on a weekly basis, but you could look at it on a daily basis or even on a monthly basis. What's more important is to compare the before and after. So when you make changes, to look at how it impacted your crawl rate and to see where the gaps are. So you would want to look across your whole site on a page type level and see where are the differences, right? What page type is crawled a ton on a daily or weekly or monthly basis, and where does Google hardly crawl? And so some interesting observations that I made in the past, for example, is that the most crawled URL in 90% of the cases is robots.txt. But then you can also look at the time that Googlebot spends on a certain URL or a certain group of URLs and pages. And what I noticed there is that the longest time that Google spends is usually on XML sitemaps, especially when they get larger. So these are super interesting observations. And again, I think just kind of digging through crawl frequencies or your log files and trying to find patterns across different page types and different frequencies is super eye-opening, right? Just look for how, like, what URLs is Google crawling on a daily basis versus on a monthly basis. That can tell you a lot about how efficient the structure of your site is for crawling, and then also for indexing eventually, even though there's a step in between.
Yeah. So when you talk about looking at a before and an after, obviously you've made some changes between the two. So what would be one of the ways improving a crawl rate on some pages would be to redirect crawl from other parts of the website. So how do you identify areas of the website that don't need as much crawl as they're getting?
Yes, that is a fantastic question. Also something that I spoke about a couple of times in the past. So for some sites, the goal would be to have a balanced or even crawl rate across the whole site, right? So you basically want all your pages to be crawled roughly the same. And that would hold true for sites that often have the same page template. For example, Trello, right? So I worked at Atlassian before I worked for G2. And Trello is a site that has a handful of different page templates, tens of millions of them, by the way, but they're all very similar. And so it comes back to how the site, what the conversions look like on these sites. So I distinguish between centralized and decentralized business models. And so Trello, for example, is a decentralized site because you could sign up on any page, right? You see like a public instance or a Trello board from, I don't know, say some company or a chef or whoever, and you can sign up anywhere. So there you want to make it, you want to distribute your crawl frequency or the crawl rate basically across all of these sites. A different example would be something like Jira, which is also part of Atlassian, but there we don't have an instance or a page type that we can replicate a million times. We basically have a few landing pages where people can sign up, and there that's the centralized side. And there you want to make sure that your crawl frequency is mostly distributed around your points of conversion, so around your landing pages. And so that it basically comes back to the question: how does the company make money, and which pages on the site play the most important role of that?
So if we have pages that we need to push to get more crawl rate on, we're going to have to get that from somewhere. So if we're looking for somewhere to take it from, what are some of the technical means of keeping bots from crawling or reducing crawl on pages that are less important, that don't drive as much conversion?
Sure. So the best way to steer crawling is robots.txt for a couple of reasons. But basically, in 99.99999% of the cases, Google follows robots.txt, and that will help you to block large parts of your site from being crawled. Say something like thin content, like user profiles on some sort of a forum or so, right? That's like a classic example, or parameter URLs, or any of these duplicative thin content types of pages. Now, there are legit cases for when you want a page to not be indexed but help with crawling, which I would refer to as like a hub page, and that's where you can use a meta no index. Now, I know that John Mueller said on Twitter, or said in general, that a no index eventually turns into a no follow, or is looked at as a no follow as well. I know that, but I so far have not observed that in reality. Maybe that time threshold is super high. Maybe it takes, I don't know, a year or longer for a no index page to be regarded as no follow. But so far, I've seen Googlebot to be pretty greedy, quote unquote, and follow as many links as it can, especially when the site has a good link profile. So coming back to your question, use robots.txt and use it plenty. You can really stuff it, and you can use wildcards, and you can become really, or get really sophisticated in how you use it, and shield certain pages from being crawled. But basically, the thinner and less important the content, the more likely you would want to exclude it from being crawled, and robots.txt is your tool to do that.
One of the odd things about robots.txt is that you can exclude something from a crawl, but not necessarily from an index.
Yes, that is correct. Google can still find pages from, say, external links or internal links, and it will then show in the snippets that where the description usually is that the page has been excluded from being rendered from being crawled through robots.txt. But yes, these results are technically still in Google's index, but you probably won't find them ranking highly unless they have recently been added to robots.txt.
Or it might depend on maybe the backlink profile. If for whatever reason they have a huge amount of links to them from other sites.
Yes, it can even determine the meta title of the snippet. So if you have a super strong, say you have a strong backlink from Wikipedia to a page that has been excluded from being crawled in robots.txt, then depending on the anchor text of that link, that could decide the title, basically. So yes, that's still technically possible.
Okay, so those are pages that are not crawled but indexed. But you can also have pages that are crawled but not indexed. So one of the major reasons for that is URLs that have indicated a more authoritative version, such as a canonical version, or maybe a different version in a different language or different targeting a different region. What are some of the typical indexing errors you might see with rel canonical or rel alternate versions?
Yeah, so canonical is super easy to get wrong programmatically. It just takes one character to not be correct, and then you run into tons of problems. So I've seen this a couple of times where the canonical had a semicolon instead of a colon, and boom, everything kind of explodes. It's super sensitive in some cases, and can lead for Google to distrust your canonicals overall, and then that's a real problem. But basically, faulty canonicals or forgotten canonicals are a huge issue. And I've seen this, for example, with site migrations, where you just forget to add the new domain to the canonical. So we recently had this. We recently had a site migration. Luckily, we didn't run into the problem, right? But we went from g2crowd.com to g2.com, and that's super easy to forget on some canonicals, especially when your content management system needs some sort of a manual adjustment, right? Some of them, or in some cases, it's possible to change everything programmatically or by default or automatically, but I've seen the opposite as well. So the default for canonicals should be that they point at themselves unless there is a different reason. So this is a default setting that I've fared with pretty well in the past. But then obviously, as soon as you have some sort of parameter or other situation where you have to duplicate content, that's obviously when the canonical should change. And so another classic error that I've seen is HTTPS versus HTTP to be missed in the canonical. And then sometimes the canonical just magically disappears by itself. So these are all things to look out for.
We also know that Google will sometimes choose a different canonical, particularly if they mistrust the ones that you've been using. Are there ways to get that fixed?
Well, yes, there are ways to get that fixed. Usually that stems from something. What I would recommend you do is to look into your XML sitemaps, obviously crawl your site and look for faulty canonicals, and then see what parameter settings you have in your Search Console. So depending on how that's set up, sometimes I see conflicting settings there that make Google distrust the canonical you define in the HTML of the page. And on top of that, I would not recommend you to use no index and canonical at the same time, because it's another conflicting message to Google. So you basically want to look out for these conflicting patterns where you tell Google two different things, and then Google basically says, I don't trust any of that.
Okay, so up until this point, we've been talking about pages that we want to get indexed. What about pages that are indexed that we really don't want indexed? So sometimes we talk about index bloat when we have a bunch of pages, such as duplicate content from an e-commerce website, for example, that really shouldn't be indexed. So what are some of the other types of pages that might be concerned in that situation?
Yeah, I love that question, because when I started in SEO, you wanted to bloat the index as much as possible. You just want to fire your pages in the index, and the more the better. Today, that's the opposite. You only want the highest quality stuff in your shop, right? You don't want anything or any content that's subpar. And so index bloat is usually used to describe a page type indexed that provides no value, and it often comes back to parameters and any sort of thin content. Paginations is something that has recently been talked about because it turns out that Google actually doesn't use the rel next brief anymore, apparently not for years. So paginations have been a classic multiplier of pages that don't provide additional value in most cases. There are sophisticated paginations out there. We can talk more about these models or how to make a pagination more sophisticated. But usually, say you have a large inventory of products in an e-commerce store, and you have 100, of paginations or pages in a pagination, then that's a classic case for where you want to look at how many of these paginated pages are actually indexed and if they provide additional value. Forums are another classic issue, and then any sort of directory related pages. So if you have any sort of pages that could look like a doorway page, say you provide a service and you created pages for all different cities in the US or in the world, and you multiply it that way, that's another issue. Fast-set navigations are issues. So any situation where you multiply a page with a factor and don't provide substantial value on these multiplications or amplifications, that's where you want to look for index bloat.
Okay. And from what you just said, it sounds like one of the reasons we don't like index bloat, contrary to what it might have been when you started in SEO, was that it can affect sort of how Google sees the entire site.
Yes, absolutely. It comes back to this idea of crawl budget, where for once, why, you kind of dilute your crawl budget. And I know that Gary and John often say that most sites don't have to worry about it, but we're talking, I think the audience here talks about sites that are large and that are sophisticated in their technical structure. So let's put the rest, let's put the long tail away and let's really talk about those sites where it makes a big difference. Yeah. And so yes, you want to make sure that Google only finds high quality content because it seems to pay off. And this is, I want to make this clear that this is another one of my observations. I'm not saying this is universally true, but it seems that Google has some sort of site quality factor that is dependent on its index pages. So if you have a lot of low quality content indexed, it seems to hurt sites in some way. So that's where index bloat is detrimental, because it's a very, very easy way to dilute or lower your overall site quality score, and it wastes your crawl budget in a nutshell.
Okay, that sounds like multiple reasons to stay away from it. Yes. I have 4 quick questions before we move on to a Q&A. The first one is, do you have a favorite technical trick?
Favorite technical trick. So the number of hacks, if you will, has shrunken over the time because Google has gotten smarter. But when we talk about indexing and crawling, I found a very efficient way to get something to be indexed quickly to be XML sitemaps. So one example, say we have a migration, as I recently talked about, and there is a page type that just takes a long time to be recrawled. So you, for example, you still see the old domain in the pages snippets in Google's index. So adding all of these to an XML sitemap and pinging it over to Google is a super efficient way to get it recrawled. And so this is something that I often use when I see that 301 redirects are not really crawled or followed, or there's another big technical change on the site that I want Google to understand as quickly as possible. Okay,
that's a useful one. Do you have a least favorite technical SEO question?
Oh man, that's a really good question. I think, honestly, the honest answer is no. I think that technical SEO has gained prominence over the last, I would say, 1 to 2, maybe 3 years. But I'm still happy when people ask these questions because it's often underrated, right? A lot of people, or most often you hear content and backlinks is the only thing you really have to take care of. But I think, and while I don't think this is wrong, right? I think these are super impactful fields of SEO. I still think that you can make the most of them when you get your technical structure right or your technical SEO in place. And that's why I don't really think there's a least favorite technical SEO question, because I'm happy when people ask at all.
Good. I'll probably have some for you later. Do you have a favorite Googlebot? You mentioned earlier, as we all know, that there are different Googlebots with different uses. Do you have a favorite?
They're all welcome. They're all welcome to crawl us as often as they want, and to come by and stay as long as they want. My favorite Googlebot, I think it's probably the desktop Googlebot, the old-fashioned type of Googlebot, because it reminds me of the time when SEO was much easier and you really didn't have to care about all these different things. So I want to stick with the good old desktop Googlebot.
Okay. And final one here. Do you have a favorite planet?
Favorite planet is probably Mars, because it's also the name for the Roman god of war. I think it's super stylish, but I think Mars is also it's not because of war actually, but because the Roman god was like a protector of the Roman way of life, and like a defender of the city of Rome and its borders and frontiers. So I just love that kind of that historical connection between the plate and the god.
Okay. So we're definitely taking questions for you now for a Q&A. We have one already from Vincent Terrazi. He says, with Bing, you can get your content in text fast by submitting up to 10,000 URLs per day. It is a good idea for indexing quickly and avoiding a waste of electricity by discovering more than 100 billion new URLs per day. So what do you think about that? Would this be possible for Google? And can we convince the webmasters to make a change?
I like the environmental thought there. That's really cool. And honestly, I think it's not far off at all, right? Even Google, as one of the most valuable companies in the world, has to household with its resources. And that is one of the major drivers for why, if you waste their crawl or your crawl budget and their crawl resources, they will adjust accordingly. So, but coming back to the question, and thanks for asking that. It depends on the size of your site. I think the amount of sites that benefit from having that type of indexing rate is probably in the thousands to maybe 10,000s. So just as an aside, right? So I think there's a limited amount of sizes that have to worry about this. And then on the other hand, I think for those sites, Google already puts away a lot of crawl budget. I don't know that for sure. I'd have to look into the log files to say it with 100% certainty or 99% certainty. But it seems to me that so far, for the most important and heaviest sites on the internet, Google does a decent job in indexing them. Exceptions apply, right? With Bing, I think because they're smaller but have a behemoth like Microsoft, which is also one of the most valuable companies in the world, I think for them it's much easier to come up with the sizes because they just have a lot less market share, to be honest, and probably their index is smaller. Another assumption that I'm making here.
Since we're talking about assumptions, we have another question from Alan Santillan, who says, in what questions would would Google ignore robots.txt? So yeah, that's definitely Alan. Going to be an assumption, I think.
Good to see you, Alan. When would Google ignore robots.txt? Well, to be honest, I have hardly ever seen that in my 10 years of career. I think what often leads us to the assumption is that Google can index results that are, or index pages that are blocked by robots.txt, but as we talked about before, can still find them through a multitude of ways. And so I think you could try to get Google to ignore your robots.txt if your syntax in the robots.txt is absolutely incorrect, right? If you might miss a little character or might use certain tags that don't work. And so I've recently read an article where somebody used a no index tag, and I might get this slightly wrong, so beware of that, but a no index tag on robots.txt and it still worked, or a no index directive. However, Google usually is one of the few bots that really hold themselves to a high standard and don't ignore robots.txt. So I would have to really find creative ways for Google to ignore it. But usually when something's wrong with robots.txt, Google might ignore it, but it does not happen a lot.
Thanks for adding your experience to that one. And thank you very much, Kevin, for being here today. It was great having you and talking with you. And to everybody participating, thank you for traveling with us today through this corner of technical SEO space. Don't forget to register for our next episode, which will be on June 19th, for RankBrain, AI, Machine Learning, and the Future of Search with Bill Slavsky. So thanks for joining us today, and see you next time.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be on.